Hello, and welcome back to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast, where we discuss and analyze literature for the lit curious reader, because why not read a little of everything? I'm Joey Kelly.
I'm Jennifer Smith.
Yes, you are. And today we are discussing the longest novel we have read together on this channel so far, which is Katabasis by RF Kuang. And I'll hold that up. You can see how thick it is. There was a copy that had sprayed edges that had a nice design. I did not splurge on that. This is already $32. That's extreme. Okay. Anyway, that was past Joey's problem. I already own it. So to start us off, Jennifer, do you want to tell us about this author since we have not read from her? I'm sure a lot of people have heard of her, but we have not read from her.
Yeah, Joey, happy to do that. This novel was written by Rebecca F. Kuang, who is the #1 New York Times bestseller, and she was also the #1 on the Sunday Times. She wrote the Poppy War trilogy, Babel, Yellow Face, and the novel that we read together, Katabasis. That just came out in August of 2025, so it is hot off the presses. Her work has won the Nebula, Locust, Crawford, and British Book Awards, so highly celebrated author. She was named to the 2023 Time 100 Next list and also the Forbes 30 Under 30 class of 2024, which makes sense since she is currently 29 years old. She is a Marshall Scholar. She has a Master's of Philosophy in Chinese Studies from Cambridge, very prestigious, and a Master's of Science in Contemporary Chinese Studies from Oxford. She is now pursuing a PhD in East Asian Languages and Literature at Yale, where she researches Sinophone literature and Asian American literature. So quite a distinguished CV for a person who is still under 30. Quite amazing.
Yeah, she might be 30 now because she was born in 1996, so maybe her birthday's already passed, but dang.
It's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. She went to a lot of fancy schools. I'm sure she's extremely smart. You can't go to all those schools and not be super smart and have all these accolades.
And Joey, one thing, I did something a little out of the ordinary for me. I was looking up the author today on Instagram, and I wanted to hear how she pronounces the names of her novels. So she says it's very dependent on the audience that she's talking to. In England, she talks about Babel or Babel, depending on who she's talking to. And she was asked about Katabasis. She said various people, including classic scholars, have told her to pronounce it another way. And she is not a native English speaker. So she's like, any way you'd like to pronounce it? That sounds right to me. I don't shame anyone for their pronunciation. Any more questions? Thank you very much. Don't be a jerk. Move on. And she literally said something like that. It was just like, guys, however you say it, you know what it means, so move on. What I thought was really interesting about that, Joey, is that she said she learned to speak English mostly through reading. So for her, if you don't hear something pronounced, you sort of make up your own pronunciation based on the way in which you assemble language together. I just thought that was also really interesting. So if it's Katabasis, that's how I'm choosing to say it. How are you saying it, Joey?
I would say Katabasis, but I've heard people say Katabasis, so maybe that's more of the British pronunciation. But either is fine. RF Kuang, Rebecca said it best. Like, just say it the way you want. We both understand what you're saying, so that's totally fine. Now that we know a little bit more about this author and all of her many, many, many accolades at such a young age, I'm going to read just the synopsis from the book so we understand like what we're actually talking about if you have not read it yet. So it starts Katabasis or Katabasis. Noun, ancient Greek, the story of a hero's descent to the underworld. Alice Law has only ever had one goal, to become one of the brightest minds in the field of magic with a K. She has sacrificed everything to make that a reality. Her pride, her health, her love life, and most definitely her sanity. All to work with Professor Jacob Grimes at Cambridge, the greatest magician in the world. That is, until he dies in a magical accident that could possibly be her fault. Grimes is now in hell, and she's going in after him, because his recommendation could hold her very future in his now incorporeal hands, and even death is not going to stop the pursuit of her dreams. Nor will the fact that her rival, Peter Murdoch, has come to the very same conclusion. With nothing but the tales of Orpheus and Dante to guide them, enough chalk to draw the pentagrams necessary for their spells, and the burning desire to make all the academic trauma mean anything, they set off across hell to save a man they don't even like. But hell is not like what the storybooks say. Magic isn't always the answer, and there's something in Alice and Peter's past that could forge them into the perfect allies. ... Or lead to their doom. Now we know the author and we know the story. I'm curious as to what your star rating is. From 0 to 5, Jennifer, what would you rate this book?
I'm going to say this is 4.5 for
What?
me.
That's really high.
That is really high. And the reason it is so high is that I loved how incredibly smart and detailed this author is. A plus 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 for body of knowledge. Great. I would give it 2 stars for how long it was. Oh my God, is this ever going to end? And I think, Joey, the reason that is true for me, as you know, I don't read fantasy novels. And one of the elements of that for me is it just takes too long. I had the opportunity to listen to this as an audiobook and it was 18 hours. Luckily, I was in a car for most of that time. I think if I was sitting in front of the book, I'm not sure I could have powered through it. So loved the book, loved the story, loved how smart and beautiful she is. The magical elements worked, but the length, -8 stars. I just couldn't do it. Couldn't do it, Joey.
I think this could be so interesting because I read a lot of high fantasy. Like right now, I'm reading one of the Dungeon Crawler Carl books that I won't shut up about. I'm reading the 5th one, and that's 687 pages. And to me, this isn't long enough. I wish this was 2 or 3 times the length. So you can see these are all big ass books, and you can see some more over here. So I'm accustomed to reading long high fantasy. Well, this is not a super long fantasy for me, but I can see where if someone is not accustomed to that genre, that you'd be like, oh my goodness, is this ever going to end? My star rating is a 2.5. I know. It's so strange. You would think it would be the reverse, that you would have a lower star rate. I mean, like for the length, you said it was like a 2, but obviously we're going to get into why each of us rated this so high or so low. And 2.5 is not a terrible rating, I don't think. I mean, it's not like a 1. It's like a B minus or a C minus, maybe.
B plus in my book, Joey. I would
Well,
really be
it's
mad if you gave
subjective.
me a 2.5. I would be really hurt.
Well, sorry. Sorry, RF Kuang. It's not you, it's me, and I'll explain why. Before you started reading this, had you ever heard of this author?
I had not. I had only heard about this novel as a result of you suggesting it, saying this is something that could be right up our alley. It is really getting a lot of attention right now. Okay, Joey, we are stepping out of our comfort zone. That's something that we have talked about. It's like, okay, let's give it a try. And I am glad that I read it. I am very glad that I had that experience. But it did cement a couple of things in for me of what I really love about literature, what I'm mediocre on, and what I'm like, no, thank you, not for me. I'm sure we'll talk about this, Joey. There was something for everyone in this book. Literally something for everyone. Whatever your interests are, it's in there.
I'm not surprised that you didn't know who she was. That makes sense. I know what you read, and it's not this. I'm sure most high fantasy things are not on your radar, which makes sense. It's nice that you've branched out quite a bit. And I feel like I branched out a little bit, but not as much as you. Because I read so like many genres and I just am comfortable with so many that it's kind of hard to push me out of my comfort zone. So we know you didn't really know who she was, and that's fine. Before you started reading it, what were your expectations? And then as you were reading it and after you finish it, do you feel like, oh, that was really unexpected? Like you ranked it very highly at 4.5 stars. So obviously you enjoyed it. Were you surprised by how much you enjoyed it? And you were like, oh, wow, I found a lot of interesting tidbits in this.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised. I listened to this as an audiobook, so I wasn't going back and highlighting and doing the things I normally do in experiencing a piece of literature. So for me, this was very much and then what happened story. So as I was listening to it, I was like, what is Katabasis? It's the hero's journey into hell. It's a descent into hell. I'm like, okay, that was a word I did not know previously. All of this makes sense. And as the story unfolded, there was a feminist angle, there was a love story, there was hate, there was misogyny, academic snobbery, there was class distinction, and maybe a little bit of autism and magic. Can animals turn into spirits? Do they have souls? What is reincarnation? Literally, it just kept going and going and going, and it weaved this beautiful story, but it was a very long listen, 18 hours. So at some point, I'm like, okay, I get it. Are you guys going to get together or not get together? Are you going to save the guy? I can't believe that some of these women who should be allies to each other, they really felt like they were antagonistic, and they sort of had an understanding. There was just a lot of this subplot under subplot under subplot that it would have been useful for me to have a tree of characters and how they're associated with one another going in. How about you, Joey?
Again, this is such an interesting thing because, as I said, obviously we have two different experience levels with high fantasy. So to me, this was like a very minimal cast of characters. I had no issue remembering who they were throughout the reading process. But I think that's literally just from practice. When you have a huge cast of characters, like I think you could kind of see Lord of the Rings at the bottom here, a huge cast of characters. So to me, it wasn't a challenge, but I could see that makes a lot of sense. And it could be something very useful for authors or publishers to include an index. They do sometimes do that, especially if there's a lot of made-up magical terms. They need to have a dictionary, basically. But I'll start with what I did like, because I have more things that I didn't really enjoy as much. Uh, I liked the disability representation with Peter, because we find out sort of late in the book, in my opinion, that he has Crohn's disease. And we get this whole chapter that is him telling Alice his story of why his reputation throughout Cambridge is like this, because he's very aloof. I really liked this exploration of what does it mean to have Crohn's disease. So it's hard for him to navigate everyday life and function with Crohn's disease. And it was interesting to explore his motivations for why he wanted to be so aloof or come off like that so that he could keep all of this private because he didn't want any type of pity. I really appreciated that in the comments that I've read on Storygraph is that people appreciated that type of representation, and maybe it felt accurate to people who have Crohn's disease and understand the struggle and how debilitating that is. And I really like the inclusion of stories like the Aeneid and the Inferno by obviously Dante Alighieri and Virgil, obviously the Aeneid. There are some other Eastern mythologies, which makes sense because she's so well versed in Eastern literature. I really liked the blending of all of those elements. I thought that made it a richer idea of hell. I thought it's nice that we see all of these things blended together, because if there is only one hell, it makes sense that all religions and spiritualities have to then coexist in this one space.
All roads lead to Rome.
Or to hell. I appreciated the exploration of asking the question of why are there so many stories of hell? I mean, you have it in Christianity and all types of mythology. Obviously, the big ones in here are Christianity with Dante, and then the Aeneid, Greek and Roman mythology. And of course, Eastern mythologies and stuff like that. It's just interesting to think like, this is something that's so ubiquitous, and there are some similarities, but sometimes they have these very different ideas of what the underworld or hell would look like or be like. And so I really liked how she was able to blend all of those things together.
I appreciate that you called our attention to this weaving of stories, that it's not just one perspective, it is multiple cultural identities saying this is what we think hell will be like. And I also appreciated the moral portion of saying, here are the 7 deadly sins. Let's just walk through these various different layers and examining those characteristics in themselves as they were pursuing the professor, who they're like, well, where would he land? He had a lot of faults. Which fault actually ended up being the one that stuck him in that category? And when you were speaking about Peter's disability, what came up for me is that they did a lot of perspective shifting. Each character had their own really clear viewpoint on the other person, what they were doing, how they were favored, how they had advantages. And once they got together and actually talked to one another, they found that a lot of those were misperceptions. As you said, Peter's like, oh, I am very aloof. I often cancel plans. I don't follow up with dinner reservations that I said I was going to make. It seems like I'm being really flighty or really, I don't want to say condescending, but I can't be bothered to hang out with you. And then we find out, I actually have a physical manifestation of a disease that is not allowing me to do the things I want to do and control my body. Again, we talk a lot on this channel about bodily autonomy. Who gets to decide what you get to do with your body? Well, when there's a disability that takes away your choice, you're a little stuck. There's no one to appeal to. I also thought that was really quite interesting, as you said, the way in which she very skillfully, tactfully, compassionately shared his story in the way that he wanted it told as a character. He didn't just want to lead with that. It's like, "Hi, I'm Peter and I have Crohn's disease." No, nobody really needs to know this. It's private.
Yeah, I think she did handle it very well, and I can see why reveals this almost halfway into the book because it's not really something that's supposed to define him. It is a character. It is part of who he is as a character. He's smart. He's handsome. He's tall. Blah blah blah. There's all these other things that make up who Peter was, but Crohn's disease was just something in the mix. It wasn't a defining feature. But I wanna go back to what you're saying where they have that conversation and then we learn why Alice wanted Grimes dead. Hey, fair, okay? And Peter, same thing, feels fair that you wanted that. But what really is not for me is that miscommunication trope in a romance, because I think ultimately this is a romance book. I do not think this is a high fantasy book. It should be a romance book with high fantasy elements and not a high fantasy book with romance elements, okay? In my opinion, because I think that was the most important aspect of this novel, and it would not have been something that I would have picked for us if I knew it was gonna be like that. I would have been like, "No, thank you. I don't wanna read this romantasy." The miscommunication trope really just gets under my skin because you can solve all of these issues between the two of you with just a literal conversation, and that's all that happens. They have one conversation, and they are like, "Well, I see you as, who you truly are now, and I fully accept you." And you're like, "Well, that's great, but this comes off very juvenile to me." And so the whole time I'm thinking, there's no sex in here, which I'm not saying there needs to be sex for me to be entertained. I don't care about that. But if it's going to be a romance for adults, there's typically at least one sex scene, okay? There's like almost a sex scene, I guess. He gets a little embarrassed. I just felt like these characters were really too young for what I would prefer to read. And so this miscommunication trope was just like, oh my God, just grow up. Grow up. I understand they're young. They're probably in their early to mid 20s. So I understand why they're acting like that, but I was just like, "Oh my goodness." One conversation. This story was told in sort of a nonlinear fashion because we're getting the current time in hell and then we're flashing back to what built up to this moment. I think it really disturbed the pacing of this book for me because we were still trying to learn so much about these characters. I felt like their motivations would have been more helpful to learn in the very beginning. Now I can see where you're coming from when you were saying with Peter's Crohn's disease this is not a thing that needs to define him, and so maybe it makes more sense to not reveal that, just show him as a fully formed person, and this isn't something that needs to define him. But I think understanding why they wanted to go to hell would have kept the tension going, and so instead, we have these tense moments that we sort of get left on a cliffhanger to go back into the past of the story. It really breaks that tension as you're reading. Sometimes it's really effective because you're like, "Oh my God, I just need to find out." You're sort of chomping at the bit to find out. But for me, it was just like, now I don't even care what's going to happen. I'm tired of jumping back and forth. I don't mind a nonlinear story, but this in this case, I don't think was effective.
I love everything that you said because I disagree on almost every single
Okay,
point.
good.
Help me understand from your perspective, this is a miscommunication trope, right?
Hmm.
And for me, it was not that simple. Neither one of them had the vocabulary, the comfort, the security, the self confidence to actually explain themselves or their situation to the other person. So it's not like I can just be like, oh, by the way, the professor sort of kind of raped me, made me his slave, but not really, but sort of did. And now he gave me this scary tattoo and all of the other things that go around that. We're not starting there. Hi, I'm Alice. I'm a recovering person who has been abused by a person in authority. Yeah, no, that's probably not something she wants to lead with. Yes, more communication would be great. And for me, the doling out of little bits of information and things from other people's perspective of like, oh, you're always his favorite. It takes me back to my brother and I. We both knew that the other one was our mom's favorite, right? We both were like, she treated you better. She liked you more. And it's like we both felt that, which obviously parents don't have favorite children. It's just not a thing, but it was one of those moments that it felt like I was Professor Grimes' star child, and then the girl came in. The girl came in, she did have her own skills, but he's Professor Grimes, which I love that she called him Grimes because you're grimy. You're just a sick old bastard. You're just so gross. he wanted her for another purpose. The reason I said I needed a list of characters, the woman who had fulfilled Alice's position prior to, who was then cast out, "Didn't you flunk out of school? Didn't you have a nervous breakdown? Isn't there something wrong with you?" And she's like, "Well, actually, let me just tell you how this really went down." The very clear predator nature of Dr. Grimes. He was stealing other people's work. Peter's like, he stole my work. He may have done sexual things to you that were unwanted or power dynamic things, but don't worry, he power dynamicked and screwed me over too. I thought that was very tactfully and convincingly done by this author. So for me, it wasn't so much a miscommunication, it was more setting up a trope of rivals who realize in the end they are so well suited to each other. The things that she can do really well, he can't, and vice versa. And that moment, Joey, when they were on a cliff and they had to climb up, she's like, "Hey, I grew up in Colorado. I know how to climb. I know how to do these really scary holds. I'm not afraid of heights." And he was like, "I literally am going to die." And I thought that was really convincingly done. And the turning around of doesn't matter who was most comfortable. Where Alice really showed me her humanity is that she helped him through it. She didn't belittle him. She didn't leave him behind. She was like, "Wow, you're really scared. You're legitimately not going to make it if we can't get through this." And then we learned he wasn't being dramatic. He also had some physical limitations that were going to make this extra difficult for him. So that was just sort of my rebuttal to that, Joey. I think the slow pacing, the back and forth through time frames was useful for me. Like you and I have a conversation. We didn't just throw everything we know about our own personal psyche and personality out in one go. We're like, "I'm just going to feed you a little bit, and then you can have a perception about it, and then we can challenge whether we really get each other."
Yeah, I get it. Again, I think that's why it doesn't work for me, but that is just a me problem and not a book problem. There's nothing wrong with RF Kuang or this book. I can see why people really love it, and there is no fault in it other than just my reading preferences. And something else that I really just felt like, I wish this was a little bit different, was that I don't think it needed to take place in hell. It felt like this could have been literally anywhere, any fantasy realm or plane of existence. Being in hell wasn't really super important to the story. And again, this is a my expectation thing. RF Kuang did not promise me this. I didn't call it, "Hey, I think this is what your book's gonna be about. Is it about it?" And she was like, "Yeah, I promise it is." And then she just like failed it. This is not what happened. This was my imagination going into this, that there would be some exploration of sin as they were crossing through the different levels or floors or whatever you want to call them of hell. I think they sort of rushed through them. They were just like, "Oh, okay, we're going through Pride. Bloom, it's a library, and we just like don't feel like staying here and finding out." And same thing with Lust and everything else. They spent a lot of time like in between all of these levels or areas of hell. And again, I think that was just my expectation of like, that feels like such an important thing, especially if you're going to talk about like, the Inferno by Dante Alighieri. He's exploring what are the punishments for each of the sins and who is there and why did they end up there. So again, it doesn't have to be word for Dante or the Aeneid. I mean, the Aeneid obviously doesn't spend the whole time in hell. It's just Aeneas goes to hell at one point and then he comes back. But Orpheus and Eurydice, the Greek myth, where obviously Orpheus goes to get Eurydice back and then he looks backwards and he loses her because he just can't help himself. I really liked that she was incorporating all of these things to map out what could be the reality of hell, but I didn't feel super placed there. I also couldn't figure out what decade this was in. From the comments that I've been reading, it looks like it was supposed to happen in the 80s. I got literally none of that. I don't know if that is when it was because there was no markers. I was trying to find out like what is going on because it didn't feel super contemporary to me, like it was happening this year. It felt it was a little dated, but there was nothing to ground us in that era. Maybe Kwong didn't want to do that. Maybe she wanted to have us guessing. But yeah, this doesn't have to happen in hell. This could take place anywhere. And so I was kind of like, nah, I don't I didn't really like that. But before you rebuttal me on that, I was just curious, have you read some of the text that she mentioned? And if you have or if you have not, did that add or do you feel like you were missing something?
That's exactly where I was going to go, Joey. I have not read many of these source texts. I have a little bit on the periphery. It made me feel very out of my intellectual comfort zone because I should probably read Dante's Inferno. I've heard it. I've talked to other people about it. I've absorbed it through osmosis of what this is about and why this is important. But
Mhm.
reading it word for word myself, I did not. And when you just said the Aeneid, and then you were talking about Orpheus and Eurydice and looking backwards, oh, I just read another story and they said, whatever you do, don't look back. And I thought that was a reference to Lot and his wife turning into a pillar of salt, a biblical reference. But obviously, there are many sources to that story, right? The future, your life is ahead of you. Looking back may always be a mistake. It may always suck you back in, possibly. I was a little intimidated, but also inspired. Maybe I should add to my knowledge. Maybe now I will read Dante's Inferno. Maybe I will reach out and read a few more of these texts just to celebrate how beautifully she integrated all of these different perspectives. So maybe when you said, she didn't really give you the consequences of these sins or describe what is the sin of gluttony, what is the sin of lust, what level does it have to be to switch over into sin territory. That was not elucidated in this conversation because I think she's like, you know, and I know, you'll know it when you see it. And by the way, if you want the authoritative text, go read all of these ancient texts, which obviously I am quoting, I'm bringing things together. You can do this too. I always ask, who was this for? I've spent a lot of time thinking about who did she write this for? It's not for me because I'm not a fantasy person. It's like Harry Potter went to Cambridge and got a degree so they could go out into the workforce and make $1. It felt like a very elevated fantasy story. It is being taken very seriously. There are degrees, there are curriculum, there is a whole department for spells and all of these things. And I loved that part of the fantasy. Of course, you go to college, you pick out your major, you do it, and then you go into either academics or into entertainment. Those were the two branches in the story. I thought that was all really convincingly done. So there were so many things that I loved about this, but I don't think this was for me because I haven't gone to Oxford. I haven't gone to Cambridge. I haven't read the Aeneid. I don't have magical powers that I can
That's true.
summon through chalk. I don't have that. And so I was like, well, this isn't for me. But I don't know if there is a huge, very well educated, very well read group of people who are like, more of this, please. Please give us more obscure references. Please give us more references to literary works in the past. I don't know. Because then she appeals to what I would say a different audience in my mind. I loved the connection. I love the power dynamics. I love the idea of can you rewrite the past? Should you? Who's worth redeeming? What's a sin? All of these things were interesting for me to think about, but also the pettiness of I use this chalk and you use this chalk. And there's all this superstition, even calling out superstitions and magic. What is magic? I don't know. But to me, there's a lot of superstitious elements and unexplainable things that go in it. So the human nature part felt really clear and truthful, even though it's in a realm that I don't normally go to.
It's interesting that we both went in this with different perspectives because I have read the Inferno by Dante and I have read the Aeneid and I know the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. I haven't really read that much of Eastern mythology, so I wasn't really super well versed in that going into this. So yeah, I was curious because that is something that is brought up in the discourse about this book is that it comes off very academic. There's a lot of stuff about math and logic and how the pentagrams are supposed to work and operate and function, stuff like that. So to me, this didn't feel very academic. I think there was some academic elements in here, like you have to know what the myth of Orpheus is. I don't remember if she ever explains it, or at least know that Dante's Inferno is about Dante and Virgil going into hell and exploring each of the levels of hell. And then with the Aeneid as well, there is a trip to hell there. So I was just curious, how does that affect someone's enjoyment of this? Or does it feel like you're missing out? Because a lot of people, even on TikTok and stuff, because it's a popular book and it's a pretty new release, people are saying the writing is really dense on a prose level and it comes off way too academic. So to me, it did not. It felt like a regular sort of fantasy story because of the relationship dynamics between Peter and Alice. It came off sort of young adult to me. I don't really read young adults, so I'm not really sure how the consent issue between Professor Grimes and Alice, if that would be included. I don't know. Somebody who reads young adult, you tell me. I was just very curious because I do get a lot of these references. So I couldn't really tell, oh, is this adding to this story or am I just sort of like caught up and I don't have to look up the reference? But all right. now I know.
Well, Joey, for me, it was interesting because I have not received a master's degree. I've not gone to Cambridge. I did not go to Harvard. I did not go to Yale. I have a lot of friends who have done all of these things. They all have PhDs. They're all doing major things. Good for them. And what I have heard about taking the academic route, that there is this sportsmanship by some, obviously not my friends, but there's this sportsmanship of showing off your intellect, of purposely being obscure, of being like, oh, well, I have a reference that no one else is going to know, and I'm so smart and I'm going to say it. And I react as a human being extremely badly to that because to me, the point of communication is to be clear to everyone that you're communicating with. So if you are purposely trying to flex how smart you are, and well, the dumbest person is the person who can't actually communicate to another human being. So when they go through this academic exercise of talking about the papers they had to write and who's going to publish and all of that back and forth, I haven't read these comments that you've seen, but maybe when they talk about academia, when I hear it also in a business sense, there are business people who get things done and there are academics who make things up and try to figure out the world. It's just like a very, very different universe. So that's what that called back based on my lived experience when people talk about academics. So I wonder in the comics, they're like, oh, this feels really academic. I'm like, backbitey, competition, petty, super obscure. Is that what they meant? Or did they mean like, man, I had to look up all these references on Wikipedia because I don't know at all what they're talking about. Don't know.
Yeah, I think it was the latter there. I think they were like, this is too dense and I cannot understand what she's trying to tell me. I don't know that I would tell people that I feel like you have to read the Inferno or the Aeneid or the Orpheus and Eurydice myth or any of the Eastern stuff. I feel like there's probably enough context in the story that you could fill in the gaps. And if you were curious, as you said, to go and read the source material, then you could. And you should because they're good. And you know what? It inspired me to reread the Inferno, and I'm rereading it right now. That's a fun experience too because when I first read it, I don't know how many years ago, it was really difficult for me to read and I don't understand any of this stuff. And now that I'm reading it again, I'm like, oh, no, I understand. So I think it shows your progress as a reader. The more you read and the more difficult text you read, if I can read The Egg and the Chicken by Clarice Lispector and talk about it, I feel like I can read pretty much anything at this point. So thanks, modernists. You really trained me to get through dense material. You were talking about in the very beginning that this felt very long. Let me just double check.
I'm going to say 560.
My edition is 541, so you're very close. I do like that they have maps in here of everybody's edition of the map, like Alice's maps and how they envisioned hell. That's a big high fantasy thing to do is to put a map in there and everyone is like, I love that, including me. I like to know where someone is on a map. I also thought this book was too long for what it was. I marked it down when I got bored and I didn't want to read it anymore, which was 320 pages in. And I was like, I have had enough of this book. I don't want to read it anymore. Obviously, I finished it because we were going to discuss it. So I was like, well, I can't just do that. That was the point where I was like, I have lost interest in this book. I don't want to keep reading. If it was not for this discussion, I would have put it down. You know what? I think I got through enough of that. I have had enough of it, and I don't actually give a shit what is going to happen to these characters because we get like a happily ever after. I'm like, oh, I get it because I figured out it was a romance eventually, and I was like, that makes sense. Obviously, you need a happily ever after. Again, this was my made up fantasy expectations of going in like this was going to be a bit more horrific, maybe not like straight horror, but more horror elements than I thought. There were a little bit, but not really that many. Where I was like, oh, snore. I don't want this to be a happy ending. Well, they only get 15 years of their life back instead of the full 30.
Joey, I love that scene so much where she's haggling. This experience did not live up to my expectations. So I think I should get a discount. And they're like, you're asking Hal for a discount. And he's like, okay, just because you were audacious enough to make the request, I'm going to give you half your years back. I just thought that was just really cute humor. And Joey, I loved that it ended up as a love story. I was talking to my partner about this story, and he's like, "How was the book?" I'm like, "Not for me." And he's like,
Even though you gave it 4.5 stars.
well, how? And I said, as I was explaining to him why this was not for me, I said, well, I learned a lot about myself, what I like about books. I think books max should be 300 to 350 pages. I'm not really interested in reading anything more than that. And I just kind of thought back, I'm like, that seems really true to me. That seems to be my sweet spot. So I was chuckling when you said, yeah, I got to about 320. And I was like, this should be wrapping up anytime now. I'm sort of done. And so I thought that was just an interesting coincidence. But I learned a lot about myself, about what I like about reading fantasy, what I appreciated. I like the academic, I like the higher vocabulary, I like the world building, the personal touches of I only use this chalk and well, I use the rival chalk. They were academic rivals who had a lot of misconceptions. And as you said, once we have conversations, once we're vulnerable, once we spend time in each other's presence, they were able to reveal their truth to each other. And they were like, we've got a lot of things in common. We don't need to be adversaries. And then, she said something about like she could smell his skin or something. Oh, that's how it starts. You want to wear that guy's t-shirt. And now there you go. I just thought it was such a beautiful sliding doors moment. They could have stayed rivals. He could have not joined her. All of these things could have gone wrong, but everything aligned because in my mind, they were fated to be together. They were so similar. That's why they were so irritating to one another. That jealousy was there. And then they were like, oh, wait, you're perfect for me. I have a friend who has a PhD in physics. And anytime he talks to me about physics or he starts to talk about math, I'm like, no, thank you. And he's like, okay, I'll make this quick. And so in the story, Alice, she couldn't do calculus. And Peter's like, hey, all you have to do is the boop, boop, boop. And he did the thing and it saved them. And she's like, wow, that was awesome. Your magical superpower is calculus. I have a lot of other superpowers that are not calculus. And that just felt very true to my own experience of partnering with somebody who has the opposite skill of you. Gold star. That is a really great thing to do because you never know when you're going to need that person's expertise. If both you and I, Joey, we're going to fix this car by talking about literature, maybe we're not. Maybe we need to have a different skill set.
Yeah, I think if I went into this knowing it was going to be heavily romantic, I would probably have reset my expectations because I think in that way it was a successful novel. I think exploring how they were actually perfect for each other and how they actually were in love with each other. That's all very sweet, but okay. It's not something that I gravitate towards. I really don't like romance in a story, especially from reading fantasy. No one needs to be falling in love. Okay, keep it out of fantasy for the love of God. And if it is, then it should be like very much in the background, not a B plot, nothing like that. Just like, okay, we fell in love. Okay, great. Moving on. You're in love. Great. Now let's get back to the story. So again, this is like a me problem and not a book problem or an author problem. She did everything that she set out to do perfectly well. She did it right in what she wanted to do. She accomplished her goal. It's literally not for me. Especially because on the cover of the book, I mean, obviously, The Library of Babel, come on, by Borges. That's what that probably looked like. And she mentions Borges a bunch of times. I'm like, oh my God, I love Borges. He's my boy, okay? Maybe I shouldn't have compared her to authors like Borges and Dante and Virgil. Not that it's necessary to do that. She did a good job of creating her own version of hell, just like they did. So I think she earned her spot amongst those authors. I think it was all my expectation. I had the wrong expectation. So if you want to read this, go in understanding this is mostly a romance, and that's the main plot. That's what I took away from it. It's mostly about this romance, and everything is leading up to that conclusion because that's what we get in the end. And I was so disappointed that Professor Grimes, this villain who could have been so much more villainous. I mean, okay, yes, he did very horrendous things, especially with Alice and giving her this tattoo where she can't forget. That's really messed up. Obviously, we learned it's good to forget. Okay, you should not have perfect memory. And of course, the consent issues where he was trying to sort of groom her to have sex with her. And then she said, no, get the fuck away from me. And he was like, oh, actually, get lost, lady, because now you're dead to me. Now you'll never get the same treatment again because now I can't use your body the way I want it to. I really did like that exploration. It wasn't fun to read, obviously, because that's not a fun thing to read, but I've never been in an academic setting like that. And obviously, I'm not Alice. but I'm sure that isn't something that happens. What I really did also like is the sort of pick me mentality of Alice and some of her cohort who are women in this story because they're in a system that sets them up to behave like that and to have this adversarial relationship, as you said in the beginning, with other women because you have to say, I am not like other women. You should take me seriously. I understand why you don't take other women seriously, but you should take me seriously. And there's this really great short story collection that's nonfiction. It's called All About the Burqa, stories from Muslim women. And there's one story, I don't remember her name, but she's an engineer. And she was talking about exactly this same type of environment where she was surrounded by women. And I read it a really long time ago, so I don't remember all the details. But she's surrounded by other women engineers who were acting very similar because they were like, I can hang with the boys kind of thing. This is a boys club, but I need to be invited if I want to do my job and be successful. So I really appreciated that perspective. I thought that was done really well. Again, everything's done well. It just wasn't for me.
This story surprisingly had elements in it that were very much for me. And when we're talking about expectations, I specifically didn't want to know anything about the story before I started. You're like, hey, there's a story I'd like you to read, may or may not be for you. It's new, it's upcoming. Let's do it. And when you say let's do it, I say yes. And when are we going to do that? I did not even know the gender of the person who wrote the book. I did not know until today when I read the synopsis of the author that this was a female. So that was a nice surprise. We look at N.K. Jemisin and we look at other people who use initials instead of their full name. It's just very interesting for me as a person who is Jennifer Smith, right? My name is very gender normative. You read that name, you have a pretty clear idea of where you think I am, how old I am, where I came from, what I might look like. I think there's a lot of identifiers in that. And when we have authors who have a less identifiable name, it opens so many more doors. I'm glad I didn't know anything about the author before I read this. I did assume she was younger because of the way in which the characters were relaying this information. I did assume that she had gone through higher education because people that I know relay stories like this. I don't tell you stories like this from my life, Joey, because it's not my lived experience. I couldn't write this book. It's not for me. That's not my experience. So I just thought that was really interesting. For me, sometimes going into a book with zero expectations, zero background knowledge is the best way for me to absorb it. Because if I, like you, was like, oh, a fantasy novel is supposed to be this, a romance novel is supposed to contain these particular elements, I might have been really disappointed. I was freaked out when I realized it was going to be 18 hours long. That did put a little shadow over. Could any of this be taken out? You and I often have that conversation. If we were going to edit this down, what would be taken out? I think she needed all those elements in there to tell the story she wanted to tell.
I don't think the crypt keys, I don't think that was necessary. We had the antagonist of Jacob Grimes. I don't think we needed this additional thing in Hell. It could have just been Mins or something like that. We didn't need like this whole other plot line. In my opinion, okay, I'm not as smart as RF Kuang, I can assure you of that. But I just felt like it's possible because she is such a well-known and beloved author that maybe a publisher would be hesitant to offer harsh critique and say, do you really need this in there?
Joey, yes, she did. These are not stories that I read. But for me, seeing the Kripkes working together, intellectuals, they met at university, they are doing their work together, they're complementary, they're a package, they have to do things. That to me set the blueprint of like, oh, Alice and Peter, why don't you guys work together? Why don't you guys be a force for good? Could you do that? That would be awesome. Thanks. And so she gave me that story. So for me, that was just like a little wink to like how this could go. It could go for the good or it could go for the evil. And the academic one-upmanship of we have to get this answer before you do because the first one to get it is the best. Yeah, I just don't like that mentality.
Yeah, I mean, no one's asking us. It's already published, so it doesn't matter. But I do agree that I think this was too long. I'm sure that some people are like how I feel about this other series that I'm reading and other books that I've read where I'm like, I wish this was 10 times longer. I wish I could read this every day for the rest of my life. So it's just based on your personal taste. I think there's been maybe some mixed reviews, it sounds like. But I think overall, R.F. Kuang is an excellent writer. I haven't finished reading Babel. There was some content in there that was very triggering for me, and I did not expect it, and that's not her fault. Okay, I could have looked up trigger warnings, did not, and then I got to that point point, and I was like, "Woo, I can't read this right now." I will return to it one day. It was very interesting. And actually, Babel has to do a lot about linguistics, obviously, because of the Tower of Babel. And it's interesting that Alice that's like her type of magic is the linguistic type, whereas Peter was very mathematic. So I'm curious. And the Poppy War series, which I have the first book somewhere. She also wrote Yellowface, which is not a fantasy story. It's about an Asian writer who has her work stolen by a white author. I can't remember if the Asian author was dead or not. I don't remember, but that's the premise. That's a very basic premise. I would read that. I've heard only good things about her other works anyway, especially the Poppy War. Everyone is obsessed with that, and I'm sure it's amazing. But this one was just not for me. So sorry, you guys.
Okay, Joey, that was a very comprehensive review of what was and was not for us. I would definitely read her again. Yellowface sounds like more up my alley
And then shorter,
than
I'm
this
pretty sure.
one. Two check marks. Okay, shorter and more in keeping with the things that I am most interested in and resonate with me. So maybe that will be on our reading list for 2026.
You never know. I would definitely read it. I really like her writing. I thought this was a really immersive read because I could imagine everything that she was saying and describing. I could see everything in my mind. So I was like, wow, sometimes fantasy authors miss the mark on that and they're too overly descriptive. And so you're like, ooh, this is too specific to your imagination and not mine. And sometimes it's not enough. So you're like, I literally have no idea what you're trying to show me. But I think she nailed it and she got the perfect amount of information so that I could see everything that she was trying to explain to me. So I was like, gold star there.
I think that is a lovely place for us to end this conversation, Joey. Thank you so much for bringing this novel to us, and we look forward to what comes next.